What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and welcome to my Double Red Sabine deck tech. This is going to be an interesting one, I think, but yeah, let's get into it. So, this is a build that I developed based on my theory that Rebel aggro should be running Tarkintown at this point in the game to counter the Energy Conversion Lab, and Consortium Star Viper combo. And yeah, let's take a look here and see what the deck looks like. So we're gonna break this down in detail. This is a deck that I've been running recently, and I've had some good success with it. Nope, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so leader and base, Sabine Wren and Tarkintown. So Sabine Wren is kind of the premier rebel aggro leader at this phase in the game. She deploys earlier than any other leader on 4 resources, and her action to deal 1 damage to each base is really nice for an aggro deck, where you don't really care about taking damage on your base because you're trying to push damage to their base as fast as possible. And the fact that she hits you as well usually doesn't matter since you're usually a lot faster than the opponent. Now, if you're in an aggro mirror, you might have to think about whether you want to use this. There's also some consideration with respect to tempo, like is it worth using this versus taking the initiative? And the answer is going to depend on situational factors. But generally speaking, I do think that this is a pretty relevant ability. The base is Tarkintown. For those who have seen my previous video on why I think Rebel aggro should be running this is a great counter to ambushes, and in particular, it goes great against the Consortium Star Viper Energy Conversion Lab combo, which can otherwise kind of lock your fighters out of the space arena. And I think having a response to that is so important that at this point I am willing to play double red Sabine rather than going red-green, so that I can have an answer that's going to kind of reopen the space arena even against opponents that are running this combo to shoot down your fighters. So let's get, this is the overview of the deck, Double Red Sabine testing. I want to flag, I've played a fair few games with this, but I haven't played like 100 games with this. I haven't even played like 50 games with this, it's a relatively early thing, but I have had some success with it early on. I think it's been, I think it's been a pretty solid build. And I'm curious to see what the community thinks and whether other people will have similar success. So this is the deck overview, and we are going to go into detail though on the different cards involved in the build and what roles they play. So yeah, let's get into it. So the 1-cost units in this build are kind of provide utility and cheap attackers. And an interesting thing in this is the 1-cost units in this build are actually better later on in the game than the 2-costers. So you usually want to use these later to try to kind of flood the board and get utility from their abilities. You don't want to start with 1-cost in general because these aren't really going to stand up to opposing units that effectively. There are some 1-cost units in this game, like Greedo or the Death Star Stormtrooper, that can trade with early plays pretty often, but these aren't really in that category. So often what you're going to use these for is like filling a gap. So, let's say that on turn 1, you play a 2-cost space unit, and then on turn 2, you don't have a good 3-cost, so you play another 2-cost space unit and a Spec Force soldier. Or maybe on turn 3, when you have 4 resources, you play a 3-cost unit and then a 1-cost to fill in that gap. Um, so yeah, so that's often how you're going to want to use these more than actually playing them on the first turn. However, if you do get to play 2 1-costs on the first turn, that can be good, especially if you have Metal Ceremony and especially if the opponent went to space. If they went to ground, though, you might end up with some unfavorable trades. So Spec Force Soldier here is your primary counter to Sentinel units. He is a 1-cost 2/2. When played, a unit loses Sentinel for this phase. This is actually worth holding in hand to play later against some builds if you know they have a bunch of Sentinels. So an example would be, if your opponent is playing Chewie, holding this guy back to play at a key moment and deprive his unit of Sentinel and let your guys attack in is really good. If you think that your opponent is playing Obi-Wan Kenobi, this can be really useful to bypass that. But against builds that don't have a lot of Sentinels, this is basically just a cheap 2/2 that you're playing to develop more units and try to push more damage to the opponent's base. Next up, we have Benthic 2 Tubes, Partisan Lieutenant. So he is an extra aggro body. When you're playing off the curve, you fill in with this guy, and he has a nice ability where on attack, another friendly aggression unit gains raid 2 for this phase. It gets +2 power while attacking. Now, in a Leia build, this ability is a lot better because you can use Leia's leader ability to attack with 2 tubes and then immediately attack with the other unit if it's a rebel, which prevents the opponent from having an opportunity to mess with it. I would say that a fair amount of the time the opponent can interfere with this ability by exhausting or defeating the unit that you've buffed after you attack with two tubes, but it's still a threat. It may make the opponent respond in a certain way that might not otherwise be optimal. And if they don't answer it, it is, a nice chunk of bonus damage. Also works really well with effects that ready your units. So we'll get into that a little bit more later once we go into the events. Now, the two-cost units are kind of your mainstay early aggression. So Green Squadron A-Wing is the premier aggro unit in space. It is a two-cost 1/3 with grade 2. Really strong. This can potentially hit for 3 damage a turn, and once you buff it with other stuff, can often be hitting for 5 damage a turn or even more. Um, Sabine Wren, Explosives Artist, is your best choice in the ground arena. Ideally, you want to start with one of those two if possible. The deck also runs 2 other two-cost units for consistency. So we have the Alliance X-Wing, just 2-cost 2/3 vanilla. That's not really as good, but it's still a solid space threat. And then, oh, sorry, I'm kind of covering up part of my presentation with my head here. That's funny. The Partisan Insurgent needs other units to hit hard, so it's a 2-cost 1/4 while you control another aggression unit. This unit gains raid 2, gets +2, +0 while attacking. And it is the main advantage of this is that it's resilient. So even if your opponent went to the ground arena early on, the partisan insurgent is unlikely to be killed by most starting units. It's especially good if you're going second and unable to arena dodge. Often you want to arena dodge, which is to say, when going second, you want to mulligan for a hand that has a ground and space unit, and then at 2 cost, and then play to whatever arena your opponent doesn't play their early unit in. But if you can't do that, or if if you can't do that, or if you have a hand that's really good otherwise, or whatever, the partisan insurgent is a nice option because it will resist most early attacks. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our 3-cost units. These are kind of aggro support. So what these are actually less efficient units than the 2 costs when it comes to just pure aggro, but they have effective abilities to support your attack. So the Fleet Lieutenant that I'm showing here is a 3-cost 3/3, not a super good stat line, but the ability allows you to attack with bonus damage if you have a rebel unit, which I believe there are a lot of rebels in this deck. I think almost everything in this deck is a rebel. So you can attack with bonus damage, and additionally, you deploy a 3-cost 3/3 in the same action, which gains you some tempo. So then the cousin of Fleet Lieutenant is Wing Leader, which doesn't give tempo, but when played gives you a more permanent buff with 2 experience tokens to another friendly rebel unit, and then shows up in the space arena. This can be a very difficult card to deal with for some builds. The Fighters for Freedom, a 3-cost 3/4 with Saboteur, and when you play another aggression card, you may deal 1 damage to a base. So this is a just fairly solid unit. I think this unit is overrated, and it's not as good as it first appears, but despite that, I don't think that it's bad necessarily. I just think that you might want something else. However, this deck has a lot of bonus damage triggers, where there are a bunch of aggression cards in the build, so you have a good chance of doing extra damage to your opponent's base while this guy's on the board. He also has more efficient stats than the other 3 costs. Next up, we have Red 3, a 3-cost 2/3 space unit with Raid 1, and each other friendly heroism unit also gains Raid 1. So this buffs a lot of your units from the space arena and is also a decent threat itself. You will probably not want to run this against decks that have the Imperial Interceptor or the Aztec Liberator gunship, because it's just too much of a blowout to have one of those units engage you. A little bit less so with the gunship or with the Millennium Falcon, because you do have Tarkintown to potentially take them out after they do that attack. But Imperial Interceptor is a strong counter to this, and you probably don't want to play this into an Interceptor. Then last but not least, for the 3 costs, we have the Disabling Fang Fighter, a 3-cost 3/2. When played, you may defeat an upgrade. Now, this is I think this is one of very few, maybe the only non-rebel unit in the deck, but it is really good. So the thing about this is that not only does this defeat a key upgrade from an opposing unit, it also then hits for 3. And so you're getting huge value when you use this unit to take out an opposing upgrade, because not only did you take out the upgrade that they ideally it's an upgrade that they spent a card on. So like if they play a Jedi lightsaber, and you play the Fang Fighter. So you spent 3 to defeat a thing they played that cost 3, and in the deal you got a like credible space threat for future turns. That's a really good exchange. So the Fang Fighter there to defeat a key upgrade and then be a threat later is really good. And this is especially good against Traitorous. I've done this multiple times. The opponent plays Traitorous. I play the disabling Fang Fighter, knock the Traitorous off. I spent less resources than them, countered their move completely, and I have this unit on the board. It feels really good, and it's a great way to deal with the opponent trying to steal a unit like Red 3 or whatever. I think just just the other day on Saturday, I was playing in a local event and had an opponent play Traitorous to capture my Red 3, and I just immediately played Fang Fighter and got rid of the Traitorous, and I believe I actually won the game on that turn. It can just be a huge reversal. So, nice unit there, especially against people who are playing expensive upgrades like the lightsabers or Traitors. Now we're going to go to the 4-cost units. 4-cost is actually the top of the curve in this build, believe it or not. This is a very fast and aggressive deck. It doesn't use the ECL ambushes with cards like the Guerrilla Attack Pod or the Steadfast Battalion that we've seen with some of the Sabine Green builds. And as a result, the top of the curve is normally at just 4 resources. And we only actually have 2 units that are at that top of the curve. So first up, we have K2SO, Cassian's Counterpart. This is one of the best units in the game. So a 4-cost 4/4 with Overwhelm is not amazing on its own. Like you could think, oh, well, you could just play the Wampa, which is a 4-cost 4/5 with Overwhelm. While K2 does have the Rebel trait, which is a lot of value, he also has an extremely strong when defeated ability. For each opponent, choose one, either deal 3 damage to that player's base or that player discards a card from their hand. This is a very, very strong ability. Now, with this build, you will usually be picking the 3 damage when K2 is defeated, but if the opponent is low on cards and high on HP, discard is an option 2 to eliminate options from their hand, especially if they have gone down to very low cards in hand. In order to resource higher, you might be able to sweep off the big unit that they were planning on playing. And usually, though, you're going to be, focusing on the aggro and using this ability to deal 3 damage to the opponent's base. So next up, we have Saw Gerrera. Saw has a really nice aggro stat line I think he's the only 4-cost 5/4 in the game. And his ability offers some nice bonus damage. As an additional cost for each opponent to play an event, they must deal 2 damage to their base. I want to say, just as a little note, I'll move my head a little bit so you can see the note there. Remind your opponents of this because I think I am not sure I have ever had an opponent take the 2 damage um, when they play an event with Saw on the board because this card is not often seen, and I think a lot of people just straight up don't know what it does. So you need to remember to remind your opponents that they have to take 2 damage to their base when they play an event with Saw on the board. But that being said, this is another aggro unit and kind of similar to some of the other stuff. If the opponent counters this, you still get some value. Like, let's say that you play Saw and the opponent plays Open Fire and kills him. Well, you still did 2 damage to their base thanks to the ability here on Saw, which is a nice little benefit to have. I think K2 is usually better than Saw, but Saw is by no means bad. All right, now we're going to talk about the events that the deck runs. These primarily exist to boost the damage you can do to the enemy base. So Metal Ceremony lets you get more damage by conferring experience to your units, and it also can let you cross some breakpoints. So as an example of that, you might give an experience to Sabine, and now she is a 3/6, and things that hit for 5 can't defeat her in one shot. So if you manage to get Metal Ceremony, and your opponent was hoping to play Takedown on Sabine next turn, now it might not necessarily happen unless they do some damage from another source. Usually you want to use this if you can get multiple, usually you'll want to use this if you can get multiple units buffed with it. If you can buff even 2 units with it, I think it's often worth playing. There are some situations where it might even be worth it to do with 1, though. So an example of that would be if you think that the opponent is about to play something that is going to defeat your unit for exactsies, exactly the amount of damage needed to defeat them. You might want to play a Metal Ceremony on the previous turn, even if it only hits 1 unit, to get that unit out of range. So just something to consider there. Another situation is where Metal Ceremony increases your power and puts an opposing unit in range to be defeated. So I had a game earlier where I used a Metal Ceremony, which buffed my Sabine up to Strength 3, and that meant that after my opponent defeated Sabine with Boba Fett, he only had 4 HP left and could be defeated himself when I played Aggression. So in that case, Metal Ceremony was lining up the situation so that I could defeat my opponent's leader with another card. And I believe in that case it might have buffed a fighter or something as well. The fact that Mental Ceremony costs 0 makes it great for attacking aggressively. And in some cases, I've even had double Metal Ceremonies in hand and been able to play both of them on the same turn, which can just be some crazy value. Next up, we have Heroic Sacrifice. Sorry for sneezing there, though I think I did successfully mute myself this time. Um, so Heroic Sacrifice is a direct damage boost that also draws a card. The downside is that it does defeat your unit, but in some cases that downside can be an upside. So if you play Heroic Sacrifice with K2SO, as is fitting for the theme and the art of the card, you can do the extra damage and defeat K2 even if you would have survived, which then means that you get to trigger K2's when defeated ability to do bonus damage to the opposing base. So if you have a full health K2, you can Heroic Sacrifice 6 damage to the opponent's base from the attack, and then 3 damage to the opponent's base from the when defeated trigger, which can be a nasty damage spike. There's other situations where, let's say your unit has to attack into a sentinel and it's going to be defeated anyway. Well, if you Heroic Sacrifice it instead, you can take out that sentinel and draw a card in the process. And that's especially good with units that have Overwhelm. So again, K2 is a great example there, where if you have Overwhelm or you have some other way to make that extra damage worthwhile, maybe you just need the +2 damage in order to defeat the Sentinel. Then it can really pay off. However, you don't want to use this. You don't want to use this early on a unit that's otherwise going to stay on the board for a while because you don't really want to help your opponent clear your board. It's best when it's winning the game or when it's on a unit that would otherwise die in that attack. One other note is that I believe you can play this card with no unit available to attack just to draw a card, which might be relevant as cycling in some situations. Okay, next up we are going to discuss the card Keep Fighting. This is a two cost event. Ready a unit with 3 or less power. So this is basically a card that just helps you do more damage. Again, you often want to use this as a closer earlier in the game. It is usually better to deploy more units that are going to make it harder for your opponent to control the board than it is to use things like this that just try to push more damage through. But the so Keep Fighting is best with raid and on attack abilities. So an example of this is if you have a unit that was given raid 2 by benthic 2 tubes, that doesn't increase its power unless that unit's actually attacking. So you can play Keep Fighting to ready it. Like if you have a 3 power unit that has raid 2, you can play Keep Fighting on it, ready it, and then swing for 5, which is very strong value. You can also set this up with things like a wing leader buffing a Green Squadron A-Wing or a Partisan Insurgent. So now they are 3 power and they go up to 5 power when they're attacking. Another example would be with both versions of Sabine, both Leader Sabine and Unit Sabine. Their on attack ability does an additional damage. So if you have them buffed by a Metal Ceremony, so they're exactly a 3 power, you can play Keep Fighting and then swing for 4 damage. So that's a nice way to get some extra damage onto the opponent's base usually. Next up, we have Aggression. So Aggression is arguably the best card in the deck. It's really good. So it provides great value and flexibility at the top end. 4 cost event, choose 2 in any order, draw a card, defeat up to 2 upgrades, ready a unit with 3 or less power, or deal 4 damage to a unit. And because of this card's flexibility, identifying the best way to use it can actually be tricky sometimes, but the upside is so high that I think it's really worth it. Um, Often you might see this dealing 4 damage to defeat an opponent's unit and then readying one of your own units to make another attack. The same caveats that I was discussing previously with Keep Fighting apply. The other thing is that Aggression can defeat upgrades, which can be really useful. So you could use it to clear out you could use that to clear out Traitorous and get one of your units back. But because it can defeat upgrades and deal damage at the same time, this can also sometimes be a great way to deal with shielded units. So for instance, if your opponent deploys Iden Versio, she's a very threatening leader, 4/4 shielded when she deploys. Most removal doesn't really work on her because of the shield. But if you play Aggression, you can choose to defeat up to 2 upgrades, knock her shield off, and then deal 4 damage to defeat her, which can be a very solid counter to a unit that can otherwise provide a lot of healing for your opponent and really stifle your aggro in some situations. All of the abilities on Aggression are useful in the right scenario, and you have to kind of figure out which one is best in the specific circumstances, which can be difficult, but the upside is very, very high. Overall, I think it's an amazing card. So that is the main deck, and now we're going to start talking about the sideboard options here. So the sideboard is even more of a work in progress than the rest of the deck. This deck is not like totally super finalized or whatever, and the sideboard is a little experimental. So I have a 1x Infiltrator skill. This is a cheap gap filler card similar to the one drops that also counters Sentinels. You know, probably you would run this against like Chewie, against you know, maybe a Luke deck that has a lot of Sentinel options, stuff like that. Next up, we have Wolf, Suspicious Veteran. Wolf is a 2-cost 3/2 with Saboteur. When played or on attack, bases can't be healed for this phase. The main reason you're using this guy is for the anti-healing. So, if you're playing against a blue deck, I think Wolf is a pretty reasonable option, as he's essentially a 2-cost 3/2, which isn't that hard for your opponent to deal with. But if you block even 1 or 2 points of healing, it's basically direct damage to their base. So, as an example, you know, if your opponent is playing Director Krennic, they deploy Krennic, you play Wolf. Yeah, you know, Krennic could attack and defeat Wolf, but you know, you basically just played a 2-cost 3/2 and dealt 2 damage to their base by blocking the 2 restore that Krennic otherwise would have had. I would basically want to bring this in against Krennic, against Iden, and at least arguably against Luke and Chirrut as well, as they often have major restore options. But outside of Vigilance opponents, I'm probably not going to be bringing Wolf in. You know, maybe if someone has a deck where they're like, you know, 3 Consortium Star Viper, 3 Colonel Yularian, like all kinds of healing there. Um, you know, maybe in some crazy scenario you use him and block the healing from Reinforcement Walker or something. But normally he's to oppose those blue decks that have a lot of healing. Next up, we have General Dodonna, Masasi Group Commander. So he is a 4-cost 4/4 that gives other friendly rebel units +1/+1, and he's a great card for aggro races. If you're against another aggro deck and both sides are kind of just going for the base, Dodonna is a good play because he buffs a bunch of your units in a way that makes it very annoying. Um, you know, this can be a big buff that will make you win that race easily, or potentially make you just start taking very favorable trades. And if your opponent has to spare 4 damage to deal with him, it's not dealing with the base. And if they attack into him, they might well lose some of their units themselves. So he's a card that I would want to bring in for aggro races. I don't think he's all that great otherwise, as compared to K2 and Saw, he is pretty vulnerable to control. So if someone plays Open Fire on K2, they take 3 damage. If someone plays Open Fire on Saw, they take 2 damage. If someone plays Open Fire on General Dodonna, they're kind of just up. So I don't like him as much against the more mid-range or control builds, but I think he's good for aggro races. The Gorilla Attack Pod is kind of your main like in-game or extension card. This can be useful against mid-range decks that you think are going to be able to stifle your early aggro at least some. So he has it's not really he, it's a vehicle. So it has 6-cost 4/6 with grit, and when played, if a base has 15 or more damage on it, ready this unit. So usually what you're trying to do with this unit is play it late in the game. The opponent's base is hopefully already heavily damaged, and this gives you a unit that is at least somewhat difficult to deal with that can push extra damage to their base. And so that is the last card in the sideboard. And I want to stress that these are not necessarily final. It could easily change. The main other card that I've thought about for the sideboard is Open Fire, just 3 cost, deal 4 damage to a unit. That would allow you to take more of a to be the control more in aggro mirrors, which might be necessary in some cases. I haven't tested that extensively. But at least for now, the plan is to go for Dodonna and Race, but I could see that changing in the future. Okay, so final thoughts on the build. I think that Tarkintown is maybe key to Rebel aggro at this phase because it allows you to counter the Energy Conversion Lab Consortium Star Viper combo, which otherwise shuts down the space lane. Tarkintown can also be used just to counter other ambushes or even just normal unit combat. It's not reliant on the opponent doing that combo, but if they do that combo and you're running ECL, you're basically locked out of space. And if you're running Tarkintown, you kill their unit easily and can start putting pressure on over there again. So I think Tarkintown is probably where Rebel aggro builds should be at this point. It's worth noting that this build abandons for a cause I believe in order to get more card quality. Because it is a double red build or a mono red build. The There aren't as many red heroism units you can play, and you end up with some just red units which do not trigger for a cause. However, I do think it might be worth testing a for a cause variant as well. So, you know, maybe you're replacing Partisan Insurgent with the, Rebel Pathfinder, and maybe you're looking for other heroic units you can bring in that are probably going to be a little worse than the ones that you're currently playing, but you do get to run for a cause I believe in, which is a great reach card. I've had some good results with this build, but it's not with this version of the build, not the For a Cause one. I have the For a Cause one built, but I haven't tested it yet. I've had some good results with this one, but it's not final. There are other heroism leaders that are also appealing for Rebel aggro that uses Tarkintown. So if you wanted to, start testing out a Leia deck, or maybe a Han or a Chirrut or something, I think those are all like things that those are all things that you could certainly consider, and that might offer better options than going for the Double Red Sabine, just because you have a lot more card variety in those, and it would be easier to run for a cause in that type of composition. I don't know. Personally, I think I want to test some Chirrut Red pretty soon as a potentially aggressive deck, but you know, there's a lot of stuff out there to try. The game is very new. I'd be interested if you guys want to try this out and let me know what you think. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below, both in terms of this specific build and also whether you think Tarkintown is the way to go for these Rebel aggro decks to counter the Consortium Star Viper ECL combo. So yeah, that's gonna about do it for this one, guys. Thanks to y'all for watching it. I'll have a link to the I know I went over all the cards, but I will have a link to the deck list in the video description below, which you can check out if you want to see the exact build again. But yeah, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks to you all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.